a little conversation up here. And I'll be very keen to have your thoughts and questions. It's good to see friends and colleagues. Thank you for coming. And my name needs no introduction. Mr. André Picard, the Global Mail Health columnist and author of Neglected No More, which I highly recommend. Had a big influence on the chapter on seniors issues in this book. I will pass the mic over to him to get us started.
And I don't think I have to introduce you. I think you've met everyone personally, so we'll skip over that technicality. So I want to just start by, it's the book, it's not about COVID, but it's about the lessons of COVID. But a lot of people moved on, governments in particular, like the whole government, moved on, I think, a little too soon. But do you think we're ready to talk about this yet, to learn the lessons?
I sure hope so. And I think UBC Press hopes so as well, so that some people will want to pick up the book. But I think there is a bit of a reaction. Jay asked me when he picked up the book, is this going to make me depressed? And I couldn't offer any no depression guarantees, but I'm hoping, and I'm thinking that people are finally at the point where the pandemic was really hard. 2020 was really hard. 21 and 22 were not a whole lot better. And maybe people don't necessarily want to think about that. They want to put it behind them. But I think we've got enough distance now that there is a moment where we can say, okay, let's try to unpack what that really was, what really happened there. And that's what I try to do with the Healthy Future, is go wave by wave. And yes, I dig deeper into Saskatchewan, but look at what happened across Canada and try to understand, first of all, what did happen. And the other most common response I hear is people read this and they are flipping through the pages and think, I completely forgot about this major thing that we were talking about for days on end. As I was writing it, I was finding news stories and saying, oh yeah, I did 4 press conferences on what was going on with teachers' vaccines. It's completely slipped my mind. Just so much was happening. That it's helpful to be able to look back, understand what that history was, and then with the benefit of a bit of time, try to extract some of those key lessons, which is really the main point of the book.
Yeah, and you're pretty brave. I was asked to do a COVID book, and I was like, no way, I don't want to read this. But it was when I was reading it, and I read it early to do a blurb, but it was what you said. I thought, oh, I don't remember that. And then, oh God, I do remember this now. So it's good to have this book just for history, if nothing else.
Well, and I've been sort of pitching, along with the no depression guarantee, that it's actually a bit therapeutic. And certainly was for me. Nadine was the one working most closely with me as I was writing this. And, mental health in the pandemic was hard. I think everybody saw themselves put in a different state of mind and struggled in one way or another, and myself included. Between politics and going back to medicine, I was burnt out, like a lot of people were. And going through this and writing this book, the day that I met the deadline, which was a surprise to the folks at UBC Press, it was like the weight got lifted off my shoulder and I felt so much better. And I'm hoping that to a certain degree people will read this and relive a little bit of their own experience and feel some closure and some letting go and some therapy for them as well.
So what was hardest? Was the hardest living the pandemic as a politician, as a health worker, or as a parent? Which one was more difficult?
Damn. How do you pick which one? Politician by far, though. Just because when you're a doctor, you can go in and you can see a patient after another and after another, even though you can't give them everything you want to. You're doing something. You're doing something meaningful. When you're a dad, you can be there for your kids. Even when Gus got COVID and wound up pretty sick, you woke up. This is our then 4-year-old, now 6-year-old. When he got COVID, he couldn't walk because he had inflammation in his muscles and hurt too much to even stand long enough to go pee. So he wound up in the hospital. That was intense. But we could be there for him and we could support him in what he wanted to do. Being a politician and particularly an opposition politician, and particularly an opposition politician who's a doctor, was so frustrating. And it felt in lots of ways like exactly where I needed to be and should be, because it was important to have a voice of, I like to think reason, at least an alternative voice to what we were hearing from the government at that time. But the lack of ability to make changes and just to watch our government in particular, but Alberta and really every province to some degree make decisions that made no logical sense and put people's health far lower on the priority than they should have. That was the hardest thing to do.
And that's what you're reminded about in the book, that a lot of the political decisions, they weren't guided by science. They made no sense. And as you said, that is frustrating. Absolutely. No. One more to answer that. And learning the lessons, how are you going to do it? The BMJ says Canada needs a wide-ranging inquiry. I've written a column, I'm not enthusiastic about that because we don't ever act on inquiries. But what do you think? Is an inquiry something we're going to eventually have because we always do those things in Canada?
I mean, it strikes me as wild that we have inquiries for plane crashes. We have inquiries when a dozen people died from a waterborne illness, and now we have something that killed tens of thousands of people across the country. And whether it's an official inquiry or some other way of examining this, nothing seems to be going on. We seem to have just done a collective shrug of our shoulders and moved on. And I look at David Naylor and the SARS inquiry. There's actually probably a good example of what you say. Really good work done. The creation of Public Health Agency of Canada, some really good progress, but then when the next pandemic came along, it seemed like it'd be just long enough for us to completely forget whatever lessons. I know BC's done some degree of an inquiry. There's been more of a look here than anywhere else. Most places don't want to do it, and I think that's largely because it would be pointing at their own failures. And I would like to see, there's a part in the book where I talk about COVID amnesties, and there was an article saying we should have a COVID amnesty, let's move on. I mean, there are certainly things that I think were criminal acts, but they're never going to be prosecuted politically or as such. Let's just try to learn. Let's not try to point blame, and I think that's the best way to approach this. And instead, we seem to have gone down the road of COVID amnesia instead, and so let's just forget that ever happened. And maybe we'll never have in our lifetimes another viral pandemic. Maybe the crisis we deal with will be completely different. We have Seth Klein here, author of A Good War, talking about the climate crisis, which is so much bigger and so much longer term. How are we going to respond to that? The things we went through with COVID and the rise of disinformation and misinformation and what worked to mobilize people or what didn't can be really important lessons for crises like that, but again, only if we learn.
Yeah, so you're right, the lessons from this should apply to any number of things, climate change, all kinds of climate disasters that are coming. But what's the number one lesson? There's a lot of lessons in the book, but what's the number one lesson you'd like people to see? We all have attention spans of 10 seconds now. What's the one thing people should retain as the big lesson of the book?
So I wrote a book a few years ago called A Healthy Society, and really what I saw with COVID was the theory of putting health as the most important thing put to the test. And so this is the idea that health is the best measure of whether we're doing well as a society. Whether we're living long or short, whether we're sick or ill, that's the best measuring stick of whether we're making the right decisions. And one of the things that was, not sure what the right word is, it's not exciting or encouraging, but it was pertinent about COVID was that for a moment, that's how we lived. For a moment, health was everything. And we recognized that if our health is threatened, if our healthcare system is overwhelmed, then your economy won't function and people won't be well in so many other ways. And I think that's the lesson that comes back through the COVID experience is that larger, longer-term lesson. Health is the best measure of our society, and our understanding of the upstream factors of the social determinants of health is the roadmap for how we actually achieve that. And everything comes back to that core point. If we take care of the social determinants of health, we will not see the same crises in healthcare that we're seeing today. If we took care of the social determinants of health, took care of seniors, people living on the street, took care of kids and gave them good educations, then when that next crisis comes along, we'd actually do a lot better. We'd be a lot more ready because we'd be a healthier, more resilient society as a foundation.
But the interesting thing to me about COVID is we did some amazing things. We housed homeless people, very radical idea. We had a basic income called CERB. We talked about the health of children in schools. We'd never done that before. There's amazing things, right? But the amnesia set in right after. Was there a point you had some you were encouraged?
Absolutely, and I think we can all remember those early moments, especially when, yes, it was scary, but also this sense of being all in this together, those taglines, we're all in this together even though we have to stay apart. That felt real. The people banging pots and pans for healthcare workers, that felt real. And it felt like there was this moment where people did put aside a lot of the partisan differences and be willing to invest in getting people housing, getting people money to live on. Unfortunately, I think we squandered that opportunity in some way. In the book, I talk about how we squandered the opportunity to collaborate across parties and to bring people in, and so quickly went back into pointing fingers and these guys are the bad guys, each deciding that the other ones were doing terrible things, when there was an opportunity to do like some places do. In Canada, there were examples of cabinet committees that included all parties and brought in people from outside the legislature. We should have and could have done more of that. That was a real missed opportunity. And I think about your book, Neglected No More, and unfortunately the story is neglected still and again, and seemingly forever. And that should have been this huge wake up for us when we saw what happened in seniors' homes here in BC, Ontario, Quebec, and Saskatchewan, the massive loss of life. That should have been a moment to completely re-examine how we do seniors care. I hope that it still can be, but today it doesn't feel like it. But there are those things that did go really well. I think it is worth emphasizing. The one that always comes to my mind is one, we went from a novel virus that nobody had ever seen before to not one but multiple effective, safe vaccines in a year. This was incredible. And not only that, we were able to roll them out in priority ways, getting them to the people who needed them first in extremely efficient fashion. There are things that we did right that we need to learn from as well. And I think when you go back to that question of an inquiry or whatever other examination, that needs to be a part of it. It's not just what we messed up or what we got right.
So let's talk more about my pet topic about, we have 53,000 deaths in this country, half of them are in long-term care homes where half of 1% of the population lives. I call it in my book a massacre of neglect. So why haven't we made it better? Why is the political answer being, well, let's build more nursing homes where people died in droves? Why haven't we done better?
I'd be really interested I'm going to throw that question back to you after a couple of quick comments because I'd love to hear what you think about why is it that we continue to neglect that population. I think there's a degree of out of sight, out of mind, that nobody's really figured out how to do it well, and that it's easier to just have people off somewhere else and assume they'll be okay, but now we know that's not the case. And we've known for years. The 4 bedrooms that drove the outbreak in Saskatchewan that killed dozens of people in one home. People have been talking about those since the 1990s. They've been saying this is a threat. These are places that had rolling outbreaks of scabies and rotavirus and everything else. And yet, when the pandemic came along, nothing was done to deal with that risk. And the 4 bedrooms are gone, but not a lot else has changed. And I'd be really curious to know what you think. What's it going to take for us actually to take that seriously and shift to more out of institution care and safer institutions for those people who need to be there?
Yeah, so turning the tables, that's not fair, but I think it is frustrating. I really thought this would bring about change in a dramatic way. 25,000 dead grandmothers doesn't motivate us. I don't know what will, right? So I think it is quite depressing. I think a lot of it is sort of our corporatist approach to elder care. And I always say, people always say, why don't we have more home care? And I say, because you can't cut a ribbon on home care. We're building a home outside Toronto with 600 beds. It's the exact opposite of what we need. But a lot of it's going to be a big ribbon cutting. People are going to be, a lot of builders are going to make money, and a lot of people be enthused. And so it's quite depressing that we just think of our elders as commodities and how can we make money off them. And how's it going to change? I think we have to change culture. So the countries that do it well, Denmark is sort of the gold standard in the world of elder care, they just value older people. It's a pretty basic thing. It's just unthinkable that you'd stick your granny in a home unless they're absolutely in the throes of dementia and wander and they're in danger. And then you put them in a really nice 12-bed home. You don't put them in a gigantic prison-like facility. And I think so, like much of our healthcare, I think we're prisoners of our history. So our history, people don't know this, but elder care came up through the penal system. It was a way of just dumping poor old people into homes, and we still have that. Our facilities still look that way. They look like jails. So culture changes, is very, very hard to bring about. But I think it's people like of my generation, the boomers, have to say we're not going to stand for the same way. And I think boomers are rich and we're going to buy change. So unfortunately, I think what's going to come out of this is more inequity. We're going to have people with money getting good care in small homes or living at home until the end. And then we're going to have worse conditions in the care homes because they're going to be for. That's the short version of my book.
And you get to that state, and then you have even less incentive for governments to invest in the public facilities, and so you go further down the road. And what we've known for years that the outcomes in for-profit homes are worse than in publicly owned, but that was escalated during COVID, where the death rates were much higher in the Riveras and extended cares across the country. And unfortunately, if we get people voting with their feet to go, the wealthy folks with influence to go into nicer homes, the impetus for investment in the public system gets enormous.
But let me ask you this, putting on your politician hat, is it impossible to do that politically, to bring about that culture change? Because there's lots of pressure for politicians to do things quickly, to do the easy stuff, to do it fast. And building a nursing homes faster than trying to have 1,000 new home care workers.
I've taken off my politician hat permanently, but I think there's a political market for home care. I think telling people that story that you can stay home longer, cost you less money, will put people to work. There's a story to tell, and it requires parties and governments with the courage to tell that story. And I'm not sure what that conversation is like in BC today, but I really hope that with a social democratic government in place, there's an opportunity here to see movement in that direction. Maybe we'll see something happen in Manitoba. Right now, where I live, there's definitely no appetite for new public investment, even in homes, let alone going down the road of getting people out of them.
Yeah, Manitoba already had the best home care, so hopefully they'll build on that. BC, it's hard to have home care if it's hard to have a home.
Yeah.
The housing crisis really affects older people as well in strange ways. And we talked about telling stories, so let's tell me a couple of stories from the book, because it does really have some poignant stories about people. We've been up here being policy nerds, but you did a good job of telling stories in kind of a journalistic fashion. So which one really stayed with you and got you in the gut?
I think each of the stories in there got me in the gut, and that's why I ended up reaching out to those folks and trying to talk to either family members or people who've lost loved ones or people who had experiences themselves. The one that sticks with me a lot is Ken Roth. Ken lives in Lawash. For years he was the janitor at the local school, was involved in his Métis Local, and he was getting around to getting his vaccine in the summer of 2021, had an appointment, but then they ended up going off on a trip to Calgary, missed the appointment. And while he was out in Calgary, he started to get sick. And he wound up in Foothills Hospital, and they transferred him back to Saskatoon. And then this was October of 2021, where Saskatchewan had the Delta, for those who got reunited with their Greek alphabet during this. That was the Delta wave, which kind of fizzled in a lot of the country, but not in Saskatchewan and Alberta, because Scott Mullen and Jason Kenney decided that they wanted to have a fun summer at the Stampede. And so in our province, there was modeling that showed that we were going to get hit hard if we didn't have greater emphasis on vaccination and likely some mask mandates. And the Premier saw that and said, there are no more measures, we're done. And come October, we were completely overwhelmed to the point that we had no more room in our hospitals, and we're actually shipping people halfway across the country to be in ICUs, in the case of Ken Roth, in Ottawa. And Ken is from Lawash, and he spent a lot of his childhood at the Prince Albert Residential School. And the way that was rolled out, because there was really no planning, was somebody just came into his room and said to him and his family, Ken's off to Ottawa, we're moving him now, and there's no discussion about this. And he said it was just like getting pulled out of his parents' house to go to residential school, and he was right back there. And Ken spent over a year in the hospital and has a lot of physical and psychological effects of that experience. And listening to him tell that story certainly brought tears to my eyes, and I felt like it was an important one to share.
I don't know if, like me, I've heard hundreds of these stories, and when you hear people say, "Oh, COVID's just a cold," does it make you insane the way it does with me?
Well, it drives me wild, because 5,000 people that we know of died of COVID in Saskatchewan. If 5,000 people, if anything happens to 5,000 people in Saskatchewan, it means we all know at least half of them, right? There's not that many of us there. Of course it's not a cold. We all saw someone die. We all saw someone get sick in our own personal lives. And it's wild to me, the degree of self-delusion that was people were able to employ. One of the fascinating things was in that really severe wave in fall of 2021, I ended up having a hard time finding people who were willing to talk about loved ones that they lost. We heard of people who got sick and were willing to tell their own story. But unlike earlier waves, people got a lot quieter about people dying. And I think it was because that was the people who didn't believe. And they would you would hear these stories of people being in hospital, screaming at the nurses as they're getting intubated, it's not COVID, it's not real, this is a hoax. So this is the other thing that we really have to wrestle with, is the degree of misinformation and deliberate disinformation that went on during this period, and how did that grow so well, and how do we fight for the facts? How do we fight for an environment in which people are looking for the most verifiable facts instead of what makes them feel better, or what YouTube is telling them, what Facebook is telling them?
And now we're seeing the repercussions of that. We're seeing drops in childhood vaccination, and it's impossible to get people to get their boosters. There's a real long-term impact of this misinformation. So I want to, I'm hogging the mic, but anybody want to ask a question, a comment to Ryan?
You sort of touched on this already, but I'm struck how the first year of the pandemic, you know, it was like social solidarity with whiplash. Because we had those first few months where we experienced, maybe less so in Saskatchewan, but nationally and here, we experienced a level of social solidarity that none of us in this room, regardless of our age, had ever experienced before. And then in the balance of the year, it all got pissed away. So I'd just be curious to hear you think, like, what did we do on the uphill of that, and then what did we do that saw it disappear so quickly?
And I think this is one of the real nuts that we have to crack with this. That sense of social solidarity was there in Saskatchewan as well, and I had never experienced it. And it was really, as much as it was a weird, isolating, scary time, it was also really inspiring. The way that people went out of their way to do these acts of COVID kindness, the meals that were delivered, the visits, window visits that were happening to people who couldn't get out. It was remarkable. And how did that get eroded so quickly? And maybe some of it was that the people who were trying to keep us safe did get carried away. Maybe there were some things that we should have given people a little more space for. I don't know. I think about things like my kids' park across the street from our house that had police tape around it for like 6 months. You know, we knew that wasn't a thing anymore, and it took so long for us to move back on that. It also took us so long to get to the point of recognizing that masks work and they're very effective. And I think this is one of the pieces that, when it comes to misinformation and that competing information ecosystem, that we need to look at is we need to trust people more with the truth. We need to give them more information, not less. We saw a tendency, especially in those early days, to not want to scare people and give them less information. Give them as much as you've got, but also say, these are the limits. This is what we know. The message, this will be a couple weeks and it's all over, that really hurt us. Because when it wasn't a couple weeks, people were frustrated by that. The message in Saskatchewan, and I think we saw versions of this across the country, but we had an April 2020 reopening, which was very reasonable at the time. We were doing so well. But I just remember we faced this together. It was all in the past tense. This is done and over, and we've moved on. And so then when we got to there was no, and it might get worse, or if things get worse, this is what we'll do. Here's how we'll pump the brakes on that reopening if we need to. None of that was there. It was all over and done with forever. And that happened over and over again. So being able to say to people, here's where we are now, here's as much as we know, and here's what we'll have to do if that changes. I think that's really important. I've been listening to a lot of what Timothy Caulfield has to say lately as well. For those who don't know him, he's a U of A researcher who looks at misinformation. He wrote a book called Why is Gwyneth Paltrow Wrong About Everything? And he debunks a lot of the Dr. Oz's and such. And he talks about pre-bunking. So also when you're rolling out that new vaccine, in your first messages, you say all the reasons it's safe, all the reasons it's something that's good for people, but also, and here's what you're going to hear. Somebody's going to tell you it's going to turn you magnetic. Someone else is going to tell you it's going to give you better wireless reception. Whatever it is that the myths that we're going around there. By pre-bunking, by being the first person to introduce that argument, you can help sort of prime people's critical thinking when they next hear that coming from a less credible source. But I've been dying to have this conversation with you, Seth, because you wrote a good war all about the idea of how we can use the lessons of the World War II and that great motivation and mobilization of resources, how we can use that concept of asking people to sacrifice and make difficult choices to fight the climate change crisis. And I love that idea, and also I watched us, deal with something very similar and get a couple months in and cave. So I'm curious, I don't know if you want to talk about it in front of everyone, but I'd love to hear what you think about that idea after the pandemic experience and how you saw us respond to that particular crisis?
Last thoughts, but it's not my thought. Let's your question.
Well, I'll corner you afterwards then. But I think people would probably be fine to hear from you.
Actually, I mean, it's kind of a related question, and I would love to hear Chef Klein's opinion on this as well as your opinion. It just, like, it sounds like from what you're saying, I mean, is that the role of misinformation may have been what you feel like sort of turned the social response to the pandemic. And do you think that that's like if you would change anything moving forward, what is the one thing that you would want us in society to do differently?
It's interesting to me, and I still have questions about that. I think misinformation and disinformation played a very significant role. I think the existence of a Donald Trump in the White House was very problematic, but also the whole mega swamps. A lot of what we dealt with here was imported from what was going on in those YouTube channels and Rumble chats, and that's really difficult to deal with because there's been a real poisoning of the public sphere in the United States, and we're seeing that washing over here. And I guess the next piece of that, so there's the straight up lying about science and making stuff up, but there's also governments seeing that as to their advantage. I remember Scott Moe writing this all caps love letter to the convoy in Ottawa, just like how great it was what they were doing. And the headline the next day or within a few days was Premier repeats falsehoods about vaccines. That to me was a striking thing because we're always very careful to talk about lying or falsehoods, and certainly folks in the press there are very careful to accuse someone of lying, but that it was just so clear that was the case, that was the headline. Why was that of value to him? Why did he look around and talk to his advisors and say, this is what's going to work for me with the public, and what is the counter to that? How are we able to foster an appetite among the public for the truth and for things that are less divisive and polarizing and more calling on that social solidarity that was referenced earlier?
Anybody else?
I have a Saskatchewan question coming from Saskatchewan. And it has to do with the polarization and the shift to the right that you're talking about. Because growing up in Saskatchewan, as you'll remember, we have a great history of social democracy. We're the birthplace of the CCF and the first place with Medicare, and there's some great pride, but you don't see it there anymore. So when you talk about these things happening, I would like to think, well, maybe there was a populist, charismatic leader on the right that suckered people that way. And I've seen Scott Moe speak several times in person, and there's no charisma to the man. How would you explain that Saskatchewan is like an extreme case of some of the flaws in our healthcare system now in the country?
There's a really interesting book by Dale Eisler, who was the political columnist for the Leader Post for years and then worked in Ottawa. It's called From Left to Right, and it really traces that shift. And his theory is that Saskatchewan's always been a bit oppositional, wanting to show ourselves as different from Ottawa and seeing ourselves as needing to stand up for ourselves. And that in the time of the prairie socialism, the co-op movement, it was a lot of self-sufficiency. We don't have a lot, and we need to figure out how to do it ourselves. And I think that was an incredible motivator as people were close to their neighbors. They were close to their neighbors physically and close to their neighbors in social status. That has changed. And I think, while Scott Moe probably isn't the charismatic leader who made that shift, Brett Wall likely was. And he was an incredible communicator, and he told a story to Saskatchewan people. And Eisler would disagree with me. He says it goes all the way back to Grant Devine, that Romano getting in was sort of a hiccup, but this was a movement that was already underway. But Bradwell was a booster of Saskatchewan, and that's a good thing to be. But it came at a time when we got wealthier, farms got bigger, people had left the farm to a great degree in the 1980s with the debt crisis of those times. So farms got bigger, the farmers who were still there were wealthier, we had oil money, we were the booming province. And I think some of that social solidarity got lost, or that idea that we needed to use government as our tool, and those collective actions as our tool, got lost along the way. And I'm not sure what brings that back. And you don't wish hard times on the province. You want us to succeed, and that's what we should do. But it bothers me to walk to work today and go down the back alley between 20th and 21st to the West Side Clinic, where I've worked off and on for almost 20 years. And never before have I seen what I see back there. It's East Hastings, right? It's what you've seen in Vancouver for a long time, but now it's in Saskatchewan, and it shouldn't be that way here. But I think of us as we're this wealthy place, we're a small place, we could take care of people. It doesn't have to be that messed up, but it is, and it's getting worse. And I don't know what it's going to take for us to have that reckoning and say, no, we're not going to just walk by folks. We're going to do something different with it needs to happen.
So why don't we have some one-on-ones and some drinks and say thank you for writing the book and get some people to buy it. And thanks for coming today.
Thank you very much, André. I really appreciate you having a conversation with me today, and thanks everyone for joining. And let's stick around. Love to chat with you more.